be missed.
All right, it is after 6:30, so I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. And I'll ask that the remaining members of the board introduce themselves. So at any rate, I'll start. I'm Roy Dahl and I live in Hillcrest, and I am chairing the committee.
I'll go next.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Sorry. I'm Brer Marsh. I'll kick it over to Gail.
Gail Freed.
This is Clint Daniels.
Matt Medeiros.
Stu McGraw.
Okay. And I think Tom mentioned that he would be later, he would be here for part of the time, so I don't see him yet. All right. Michael, do you want to start your presentation?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and get into it. Oops, give me just 1 second. Just letting the last few people in. Actually, sorry, let me do just one other thing here. Good to see everyone. Happy New Year. Tonight we're going to cover mobility. I'll introduce the mobility team in a second, just doing some sort of back-end logistics. We'll have a fairly lengthy presentation, go over a lot of the major mobility components, present some draft concepts, and then we want to get into, we'll have a polling and then have time for Q&A amongst the board members and then the public as a whole as well. And so with that, I will share my screen. And can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right, so I'm sure most of you know who I am. I'm Michael Prinz, project manager for the Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment. With me tonight is Tanner French, senior traffic engineer, Monique Chen, and Fong Nguyen from Chen Ryan and Associates, our mobility consultant. We also have other city staff on the line, including Claudia Brizuela, a traffic engineer in the mobility department, and members from Diet and Batia and City Thinkers are available here as well to hear what the community has to say. As we move through the presentation, if you have questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. And then once we get to sort of the completion of the presentation, if you could raise your hand and Roy, the chair, will help sort of facilitate the discussion and comment and input. For any questions and answers that sort of get raised and answered in this meeting, we will prepare a response document and upload that to the Hillcrest website. With that, I will turn it over to Tanner French.
Okay, thanks, Michael, and thanks everybody for joining us. This is kind of an agenda, the major sections or the main sections that we'll be going through, including existing conditions, a quick review, the mobility planning approach, roadway concept visioning, operational treatments, alleyway activations, and then we'll kick it back to Michael to kind of go over next meetings and next steps. So if you can head to the next slide there, Michael. So again, thanks all for joining us as we discuss the mobility aspects of the Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment. As mentioned, I'm Tanner French, a senior traffic engineer in the city of San Diego. I'm relatively familiar with some of you and the Hillcrest community from my time managing the Uptown Community Parking District for several years while in the Economic Development Department. And before I get started, Michael introduced briefly Claudia Brizuela, associate traffic engineer. I just wanted to introduce her again and just note that Claudia and I will both be working on this plan, and in fact Claudia will likely be doing kind of a lot more of the day-to-day activities. So I wanted to introduce her quickly. So city staff gave a relatively thorough presentation of the existing conditions report in July, so I won't be spending a ton of time on that tonight. However, it is worth noting some of the metrics and factors that we've evaluated and understand how we'll use those to make recommendations in the plan update. For instance, in the pedestrian mode, as shown here, it's important for us to note and understand locations where collisions are occurring, or understand where there is a high propensity for pedestrian activity, where the pedestrian network might be lacking. So we'll be looking at things like that. Next slide. Similarly, for the bicycle mode, understanding locations where collisions are occurring, the high propensity for bicycle activity, and where the network may be lacking, but also understanding where other entities like SANDAG are planning and implementing bicycle facilities, so that'll best inform our plan. Next, for the vehicular mode, the existing conditions again will help us identify locations where collisions are occurring and where there's traffic congestion. Also, existing conditions identify roadway typologies, which help us determine an appropriate long-range makeup. For instance, the characteristics of Washington Street, the large width, the grade separated intersections, the lack of fronting land uses, all help inform ideas about what its future best makeup is. And Chen Ryan staff will delve deeper into that topic later in the presentation. Next slide. So in some regards, transit is a bit more complicated, given the fact that another entity, SANDAG, plans regional transit, and yet another entity, MTS, operates transit. But a similar process is still used. We look at key metrics like ridership propensity, traffic congestion, and walkshed to inform our future plan. In this slide, you can see that nearly the entire community, with the exception of a portion up by the medical center, is within a quarter mile walkshed of transit. This means that transit can and should be a viable option for this community. Next slide. As mentioned, because other entities control transit, it's not only important for us to understand the existing transit conditions, but also to keep an eye on the future planned transit. This slide depicts planned transit in SANDAG's current regional transportation plan and the current Uptown Community Plan. This includes local bus service, streetcar, arterial level bus rapid, and light transit. Each of these have implications as to how other modes can fit into the transit network. Next slide. So this slide depicts planned transit in SANDAG's draft regional transportation plan, which is currently being updated. Along with many of the same treatments, this includes the possibility of a commuter rail, a much more intensive infrastructure. This would have a completely different set of implications regarding how other modes fit in the roadway network and what would be needed at the transfer nodes. So it'll be our job to communicate with SANDAG on this issue and make sure our plan reflects the likely outcomes of their plans and making sure that they're kind of cohesive. Next slide. So with that, let's transition into the mobility approach portion of the presentation. Although each plan update is unique and will be tailored based on unique factors for each community, fundamentally and from a policy perspective, our process is relatively uniform. At its foundation, the mobility planning approach looks to achieve goals identified in other city policy documents. These documents include the Climate Action Plan, specifically by reducing vehicle miles traveled and shifting commute mode share away from single occupancy vehicle and towards transit and active transportation, thus reducing greenhouse gases. Complete communities, specifically by identifying and prioritizing funding for active transportation improvements in communities that need them most. Vision Zero, specifically by creating modal networks that are safe for all users, including those that are most vulnerable. And finally, the city's general plan and current community plan, where applicable. So with that understanding of the basis of our approach, I'll pass the presentation over to Monique Chen from Chen Ryan and Associates. Monique will start by covering some of the more technical aspects of the mobility planning approach. And before I pass off, I just want to make a note here that the options and concepts that we're going to be showing tonight are at a high level and really are just for the purposes of this preliminary discussion. A lot of vetting and coordination and analysis will have to occur before any of these options would make it into the plan. So with that, I'll pass it over to Monique.
Great, thank you so much, Tanner. I would just take a minute to kind of talk about the mobility planning process, and then as well as some of the technical tools that we use to ensure the planning document and then outcomes is really taking care of all modes of transportation. Starting off with a robust data collection and the existing conditions reports, as Tanner mentioned, that has been done, and then the map atlas is online if you need some reminder about some of the existing findings. And then now we're in the stage, just entering the stage of the big box in the middle. And the team here is going to be delivering or developing some mobility concepts and networking alternatives, but through working with you, the land use consultant, city staff, as well as the citywide kind of mobility goals and policies. And we're going to be kind of evaluating, fine-tuning, and doing engineering feasibility on these potential mobility options and networks. The goal is that before we move into the red box, that's where the preferred alternative is derived, is that we're already looking at the networks that we're moving forward is going to be feasible. So we're not going to be visiting backwards, say, oops, something is not working. And then from there, we're going to be performing mobility analysis for the preferred networks, and then finally draft the element in the mobility plan. The one thing I want to focus on here, as you can see on the top of the flow chart, is that community engagement is the most important thing as part of this planning process, because we're experts in mobility planning and traffic engineering, but you're all experts in Hillcrest. And so we want to work with you, hear from you, and hopefully this plan at the end of the day is a plan that comes from all of us. Next slide, please. And quickly, how can we really evaluate all of these modes? So here's the matrix that the city of San Diego developed a few years back, and that has been utilized for all of the long-range mobility planning. So to the left, you see the performance measures. That's demand, connectivity, quality of the facility, as well as safety. So the goal here is that we've already analyzed all of this under existing conditions. However, we're going to wanting to also doing the same kind of analysis for the future alternatives. And this is going to provide us, kind of an equal look at all of these performance measures and to evaluate, what is kind of the preferred network for each of the mode of transportation, whether you're walking, biking, riding transit, or driving. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Fang Nguyen. But again, to reiterate what Tanner was just saying, none of the concept that Fang is going to be talking about has been vetted. This is a very high level discussion on gauging interest. And so we're certainly going to be working our due diligence to make sure, like I mentioned, the alternative that gets moved forward are going to be feasible. With that, I'll turn it over to Fang. Thank you.
The next slide, please. So building on the previous slide and as well as the matrix, in order to develop a concept, we look at Hillcrest as network as a whole. As you can see on your screen, we have a grid network in Hillcrest, but it's a very limited grid network with 3 major east-west street and about a handful of north-south street, with a few on-ramp and off-ramp focusing primarily along SR 163. Next slide, please. First, we'll look at the north-south street. There are 3 major corridors that we considered that would provide vehicular access throughout the community, and also inter-community to other community and freeway access. First, we have 6th Avenue, which provide freeway access and also provide access to Bankers Hill and downtown San Diego. Whereas Richmond Street provide access to Balboa Park, primarily for residents who live on both sides of Richmond, and also some freeway access via a ramp on the southern side of the road. Park Boulevard itself provide transit access and intercommunity access, including the existing BRT, but also the planned BRT line straight up and down Park Boulevard, connecting the community to University Heights and as well as further south to downtown. 4th and 5th Avenue, we're not discussing because 4th and 5th have a lot of active transportation facility already in conjunction with the light rail that being planned in the draft RTP. So those we will go with the regional plan for those. Next slide, please. In terms of east, Michael, can you, yes, thank you. In terms of east-west street, we have 3 major corridors, Washington Street is primarily very vehicular oriented. It have very few facing business, few shopping centers that need full driveway access, and very few front facing development. University Avenue, on the other hand, is an active commercial corridor with a existing bike lanes as well as high demand for parking and a lot of businesses that operate throughout the day. Whereas Robinson Avenue is designed more like a slow street with focusing on just residential access, multimodal access, but not so much transit. Next, please. So in order to evaluate the potential concept today, we'll focus on University Avenue. This is the section between 10th Avenue and Normal Street. This is also the widest sections of University Avenue with 110 feet curb to curb within certain segment. Next, please. Under the near-term conditions, SANDAC is planning to construct a one-way cycle track on both sides of University Avenue, and doing that by inching the diagonal parking closer to the vehicle lane, basically doing a swap of the existing condition right now to provide for a safer environment for cyclists. And since this is the first slide, you can see under the grading criteria, all of the mode remain the same as existing or near-term condition, with the exception of bicyclists who see an increase in the quality of the facility. Next slide. For the next 4 options, which we will also take a poll at the end of these, which these aim to maintain the existing vehicular access along University Avenue. Under option 1, we would provide a light rail or BRT access along the center line of the road with cycle track on both sides, and in exchange for converting diagonal parking to parallel parking. So as you can see on the screen, both bicyclists, transit see an increase in the quality, whereas there's a slight decrease in terms of parking availability. Pedestrian and vehicular remain the same as near-term conditions. Under option 2, it's very similar to option 1, but in exchange for removing parking along University Avenue, we are now able to increase the width for sidewalk and outdoor dining on both sides. Cycle track and transit access still remain the same as near-term conditions. Next slide, please. Option 3, it seeks to maintain a balance between all mode. However, when you try to maintain all mode, there is quite a bit of an exchange. The parking will be converted from diagonal to parallel. Bike and transit will share the same lane, such as the implementation on El Cajon Boulevard right now. And the number of lanes for vehicles still remain the same as near-term conditions. And then finally, under option 4, we would provide a transit-only lane on both sides, still providing cycle track, but in exchange, parking would need to be removed along both sides of University Avenue. So under these 4 options, as you can see, there's quite a bit of trade-off between all the modes, and that brings us to our next slide, where we look forward to your opinions on what do you think of these 4 options. So as the poll pop up, I would just go over, just remind you of the options that are available. Option 1 would convert diagonal to parking to parallel. In exchange, we are able to gain additional space for an exclusive transit lane. Option 2, gain more space for pedestrian, but we would remove parking on both sides. Option 3 is a transit and bike share option, and there would be parallel parking. This is also the most, the option where we seek to balance all mode. Granted, not all of them are quality facilities. And then option 4 would be to remove parking in order to provide spacing for cycle track and exclusive transit lane.
So while the poll's running, we'll give it probably another, 30 seconds, 30 to 45 seconds. One thing that I want to mention is that we are recording this meeting, but the results of the poll won't be shown in the actual recording. So we'll go ahead and sort of verbalize them here. Fawn can sort of, read them off and what that indicates. Obviously, this is, just a snapshot in time and sort of one component but we felt it was good to sort of, while we're going through this, sort of get your ideas just on these 4 options, and then we can discuss them in detail following the completion of the presentation. So I'll give it about another 20 seconds or so. We've got about 29 of the 41 current attendees who've voted. So I'll just again give that a couple more for people to vote, and I'll shut it off at basically the 2-minute mark here on my little counter. And okay.
So Michael, on this, I can assume that everybody else probably has another option in their head that they think is better than these 4. But what we're really asking is, which of these 4 would you prefer? Just to be clear.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. So here are the results. And like I said, I don't know if these will be shown on the screen, Fong, if you want to sort of go through them.
Yes. So based on the result, the option 2 is leading with 47% or 14 vote, followed by option 3 with 23% or 7 vote. Option 4 have 7% or 2 vote, and option 1 have 23% or also 7 vote. So those previously we seek to maintain vehicular access along University. So now we are moving forward to a different concept for University and Robinson Avenue. One-way couplet have been used and demonstrate to show a much more efficient way to process vehicular, such as you can see in downtown San Diego, where a lot of the one-way street allow for efficient vehicular movement. At the same time, by doing that, we can also recover the existing space to provide them for other modes, such as cycle track, increase in pedestrian spacing, as well as transit priority. So the next few slides will go over the couplet options. Next slide, please. This is one concept for the couplet option. Under this option, we would provide along University Avenue, we would provide for a contraflow transit and a 2-way cycle track. Parking will be provided on one side, and we still maintain 2 lanes for vehicular access. Vehicle will be traveling westbound along University Avenue and then eastbound along Robinson. And then along Robinson Avenue, we would be able to convert the existing, on one side, convert the existing parallel parking to diagonal parking, or use some of those excess space for pedestrian amenities such as a parklet or a small pocket park. That's shown under this options, bicycle and transit quality would increase. Vehicular would remain the same along University Avenue, and there's a slight loss in parking. Along Robinson Avenue, pedestrian and vehicular access actually increase. Transit and pedestrian remain the same, and there's a slight increase in terms of the number of parking space. Next slide, please. Another options by converting to couplet would be to along University Avenue to reuse the excess space for pedestrian amenities such as outdoor dining and wider sidewalk. This is done by also providing a contraflow transit and a 2-way cycle track and parking on one side. The parking would be parallel. Along Robinson Avenue, we will not be converting parallel parking to diagonal, rather maintain the existing parallel parking. But by doing so, we can provide a high quality buffer bike lane throughout Robinson Avenue, which would provide access for just access for resident along both sides. Next slide, please. And it's time for the next poll. We would like to see how you feel about the couplet concept.
So we'll give this about a minute, let people just sort of review the question. This one's pretty self-explanatory, whether, sort of you support, strongly support, somewhat support, do not support, or strongly do not support. We've got about a little over half the people who voted thus far. Like I said, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll close the poll. Excuse me, just as a point of reference, we've got just a couple more polls to go through, and then, like I said, once we move through our presentation, we'll open it up for fuller discussion about all the concepts that are being presented. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll right now, and here are the results. Go ahead, Fong.
So based on the result, 32% of the vote strongly support, or 9 vote. 21% somewhat support, or 6 vote. 7% or 2 vote support. 32% do not support, or also 9 vote. And 7% or 2 vote strongly do not support. So as you can see, the challenges with working within the existing right-of-way with University Avenue. So that will bring us into the next slide, or the next concept, which is what if we were to convert University Avenue between First Avenue and Park Boulevard to transit multimodal and emergency access only? Vehicular access will be primarily provided along Washington Street and also Robinson Avenue. Next slide, please. And this concept is driven by what's been implemented successfully in other cities, such as Washington Avenue in Minneapolis or the 16th Street Mall in Denver. Under both of these, there are much more right-of-way to work with to provide extra amenities for active transportation, emergency access, and also pedestrian and transit. Next slide, please. Shown on your screen are 2 potential concepts if we were to change and convert University Avenue to active transportation, transit, and emergency access only. Under option 1, we would be able to provide 2 contraflow transit lane, also a cycle track, as well as by reutilizing the excess space, we can increase the space for pedestrian amenities, such as outdoor dining, pocket park, and also just wider sidewalk. Option 2 would be to switch and move the transit lane to the center median, have cycle track on both sides, and still provide the same high quality pedestrian amenities on both sides of University Avenue. Next slide, please. It's time for our next poll to see how the audience would feel about converting University Avenue to transit and active transportation only corridor. We understand that there will be some challenges along this corridor as well, especially tight crossing space, such as across the 163. But this is concept. This will also be a vision we'll carry through as we analyze all the corridor throughout Hillcrest.
So we've already had about 60% of the people respond so far, so I'll probably close this off pretty quickly. We've got, now we're up to 70% of the people who've responded. I'll probably give it about another 5 or 10 seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close this poll. Pretty decent mix so far across the board, and appreciate everybody staying involved and engaged on this. Okay. So here are the results.
So based on the poll result, there are 41% or 13 votes strongly support this concept. 6% or 2 vote somewhat support. 6% or 2 vote support. 22% or 7 vote do not support. And 25% or 8 vote strongly do not support. That brings us to our next poll, which would be to prioritize the mode along University Avenue. As you can see, there are some challenges with trying to provide high quality for all modes. So please pick 2 out of the voting that you see on your screen.
And this is the last of the actual polling questions. We'll move through the next portion of the presentation, then we can always go back and discuss the options and concepts following the end of the presentation as well.
Hey, Michael, while everybody's finishing up this last poll, I'll just note for all of those using the chat, and obviously there's a question and answer, but I don't think we're going to get to all the questions that are being raised in the chat. There's a lot of good questions that are being raised in the chat. So generally what we will do, especially with questions that are addressed to city staff in the chat, or just ones that, we think that there are reasonable answers for, right? Not just the chatting back and forth between members, but we'll take time afterwards to kind of collate those and provide responses where appropriate and send through Michael, so that those can be viewed and seen in kind of a format, so answers can be shown there.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll now, and we'll go ahead and share the results.
So based on the result, 53% or 17 vote prioritize bicycle facilities, 41% or 13 vote prioritize wider sidewalk, 44% or 14 vote prioritize active public space, 9% or 3 vote prioritize on-street parking, 47% or 15 vote prioritize transit facilities, and 6% or 2 vote prioritize vehicular facilities. And in order to accommodate all the modes, as well as reducing the amount of vehicular trips that travel throughout the community, one way is to convert short trip to bike and walk trip, which a lot of people within the community already done. But there's also portions of the community that are afraid for one reason or another to convert their vehicular trips to bike and walk trips. And there are treatment that we will consider for operational treatment that we will consider as we go through the analysis process and the conceptual plan for the community. Next slide, please. Some of the operational treatment that we will consider include, as you can see on the screen, include bulb out to reduce crossing distance for pedestrians, protective crossing for bicyclists and pedestrians to move them out the vehicular blind spot, lead pedestrian interval to increase pedestrian visibility, high visibility crosswalk, as well as countdown pedestrian signal. Next slide. Other options include, as shown on your screen on the left, would be to construct a protective intersection. So this is a concept for Robinson Avenue and Park Boulevard. Under this concept, bicyclists who does not feel comfortable making direct left turn from one street to another can actually get off the street and then cross safely at the highlighted crosswalk. Whereas cyclists who are comfortable can still remain as on the road as a vehicle and make that movement. Other treatment that we will consider include pedestrian scramble, which was first implemented in Gaslamp Quarter, but now is implemented throughout San Diego County, especially in an area with high pedestrian demand. To supplement all these, we would include stuff such as a blank out no turn on red sign. These sign would work in conjunction with the pedestrian scramble or an LPI to ensure a safer crossing environment. Next slide. Other operational treatment that we will consider including pedestrian hybrid beacon, such as the one shown from Mission Valley, or a rectangular rapid flashing beacon in order to increase pedestrian visibility. While we did talk about University Avenue for the most of this presentations, all these treatment we consider for all the corridor throughout the communities and not just University Avenue. Next, please. And then also in order to improve the pedestrian conditions, especially in Hillcrest where there's a lot of nighttime business that open late, we will also include pedestrian scale lighting. And this is not just for the businesses, but also along residential corridor to increase visibility and safer feeling for people who need to walk to and from their businesses or resident at night. Next slide. Lastly, this concept has been introduced by SANDAC, but it's the mobility hub. Under this concept, mobility hub would provide not just a high quality waiting for transit services, it also provides storage space for that first and last mile micromobility such as scooter or bike, as well as a docking stations for the Hillcrest shuttle. Next slide. And then we heard you from the last meeting regarding the usage of alleyway throughout Hillcrest. And we understand that alleyway throughout Hillcrest is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we cannot just activate everything because some alleyway, such as the one behind Ace Hardware, provide access and loading area for the businesses, whereas other alleyway are primarily being used as just garage access for the resident. So as we go through this process, we will identify the purpose of those alleyway and what level of activation can be done to alleyways. Next slide. And there are a variety of different ways to activate alleyway. On the right of your screen is an alley in Detroit. There was not much done to this alleyway except to increase public art, have a very clean and pedestrian scale lighting to make it safer for user who desire to use the alleyway. It's also activated by increasing foot traffic, but at the same time, it does not restrict any vehicular access. On the top left is a temporary activations just for an event such as, this can be used for events such as City Fest. And then on the lower left, it's more of a permanent activation with outdoor dining space. So we will consider these options as we go through the process of analyzing and providing recommendations as part of this project. Next slide. And with that, I'll pass it back to Michael.
Great. This just kind of gets into what our next steps are, but we can sort of cover this back at the end of the meeting. And so I will, we covered a lot of ground here, obviously, right now. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment and turn it over to the chair to sort of begin asking questions and how you want to facilitate the Q&A.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with the general public. The subcommittee members can hold their comments till after we hear from the rest of the people.
And
so
as
if you'd like to speak, either wave your hand or turn your mute off and say something, and try not to all do it at once.
Yeah, I'd prefer if, the easier approach would be request that members of the public who want to speak to please raise your hands. Or if you're having trouble with raising your hand function, just throw your name in the chat and Roy and I will monitor that to call on you to speak. So I see that the first person with their hand raised is Helen Rowe Allen. I will ask you you can go ahead and mute, ask your question.
Thank you for acknowledging me. I'm extremely interested in this subject matter. I am a dedicated walker, although I'm obviously not walking at this time. In all of this, I hear a lot of talk about bikes and parking and parklets and dining, couplets and outlets and so on. But I hear very little about walker pedestrian safety, and that's a concern for many of us at this time and juncture. I think most of our Uptown District residents are more walkers than bikers. And so I would suggest we pay a little bit of more attention to our walker safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
I believe Michael Donovan's next.
Hey, thank you, Michael. The concern I have is kind of tangential to this. The early survey information you provided several meetings ago was that the vast majority of people commute either in or out of Hillcrest, and the number of people who live and work here is fairly small. And so we're going to continue to have a lot of vehicular traffic in and out and through the area. Unless we include somewhere in this plan a way to begin to attract more places for people to work. If we don't up the employment of people who live and work here somehow, then a mobility discussion is really about how do we support all the commuters who go in and out, right? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Sanjay Stone.
Hi, yes, thank you. So so I want to mention, I agree with Helen on the part of the pedestrians in terms of, I think that it's important that we account for them. I think that wider sidewalks in Hillcrest, there are a lot of sections of West University that actually have pretty narrow sidewalks, especially right on the edge between by the elementary school and the lodge. But also the bike facilities I think are important. I live on West University in Mission Hills. I see bicyclists every day. I ride my bike to work on a regular basis. And I actually work down in National City, which is a pretty far bike ride. And the facilities on West University are on University in Hillcrest are not the greatest. And it would be a lot nicer to having transit, I think, is also really important. I think to kind of touch on what Clint said on the chat, I think the transit only makes a lot of sense if we are following Sandag's 5 big moves. But I think if we implement it too soon, we could put ourselves in a situation where we're hurting businesses, because if we don't have the transit to support getting rid of the cars. So I think, but having segregated bike lanes, I think, is really important for University Avenue as a whole, to allow for all the bicyclists that are going in and out between Hillcrest, North Park, Mission Hills, Point Loma, so that they have a thoroughfare to get through the city.
Thank
Great.
you. Next.
Thank you. Marcella?
So just a couple quick comments. I think I always have some concerns about those. I forget what exactly those little light crossings are called on Washington Street. The ones with the little rectangular flashing lights. I've seen people come within an inch of losing their life there because people in cars just do not pay attention to them at all. So I don't know if there are some thoughts about replacing those with some safer crossings, but I think that they definitely have some issues. And then one of the things that we were talking about in the chat was perhaps there could be some thought given to a central parking hub to help the district. I know that at one point, there was a bunch of us looking at a bunch of different projects, and we were looking, I think it was at the Rite Aid parking lot, to see if that could be, if something could be worked out with them, or in just some central area where there's a big parking lot where that could maybe be converted into a parking hub. I know the parking district has some money, and maybe that could be leveraged, and then even possibly put a park or a plaza on top of the parking hub to actually provide some more open space opportunities and really get the biggest bang for the buck for something like that, and also help the businesses. And I think that would actually encourage a lot more single trips, walking, and other mobility choices. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Lou.
Thanks, and thanks for your presentation, Michael. My concern here is that we're all kind of liking everything. We all want bikes to have better, safer, greater opportunities, and we all want safer walking, pedestrian, and more pleasant pedestrian experiences and wider sidewalks. And we all want the businesses in Hillcrest to flourish, but my concern is that this focused plan amendment is in part saying, let's have a lot more population density. And I understand the reasons why in Hillcrest core, but we don't control the transit, and we might all love the idea of a trolley or a train, but we're not able to do that. And some of these changes would be very expensive. And my fear is that we'll go ahead with parts of the plan, putting more people in place, and not the other parts of the plan will sort of do a little bit or halfway or sort of, or some of them, or the least expensive options. And then we'll have really complicated and made a problem worse for businesses and for residents both, because both are important. I mean, we're in this together. I think Sanjay's point about the reality is that now we have most of our people who are patronizing businesses in Hillcrest coming from the outside in, and that most of the people who live in Hillcrest are doing commutes, often long commutes out, and not everyone is able, for a lot of reasons, to do it all on a bike the way Sanjay does. And so my real concern here is that you want to kind of say yes to everything, but I'm very concerned about more population density, some experimentation with the things that tend to be less expensive to do, and not that they're cheap, and not that they're not important or valuable, like bike lanes, but we're going to end up without the parking. We're going to end up impacting businesses because people don't come to Hillcrest because they're circling and circling and circling to find parking spaces, and we're going to have more people. I'm not a fan of parking for parking's sake. I would love it if we didn't have as much car traffic, but if we don't figure out the ways and have everything in place to avoid it, you're going to really have impacts that I'm concerned about, short term, meaning in the next 5 years, and long term. And I understand the environmental goals and why they're so important to the city and why that's policy, and it's important to all of us. But there's a bit of magical thinking sometimes. I think that this is all going to coalesce and be affordable. And so then it's going to come down to what pieces do we go with? And developers are going to want to put more apartment buildings in there. And we know that. But that will get funded, but will the other stuff happen that makes that so that we still have the balance that works for our wonderful community? Thank you. Oh, can I ask one other question? It's a very specific question to Michael. Where do all these responses to the chat messages go? Because I've looked on the Plan Hillcrest website and I don't see responses to community feedback there. So where are those?
I believe we post, let me look into that for the previous meetings. I know we've posted the chat logs on some of them. And if they're not posted, I'll go back and make sure that they're posted for the previous meetings. What was discussed tonight is not only will the chat log be posted, but some of the questions may be rather technical and specific as it relates to operational improvements or mobility analysis. And so what our mobility team has committed to do is to basically call those more technical responses into a document that could then be posted onto the website. Kathy Keehan, good to see you.
Hi, thanks for allowing us to comment today. This is a really interesting presentation, and I appreciate all the data that you guys and all the analysis that you've put into it so far. I think for me, I agree with Lou in that we have a lot of priorities that we want to fit in, and it's easy to try and say yes to everything, but I think we might need to make some hard choices. I think if we want livability in Hillcrest, if we want strong business environment, we have to focus on livability. That means walkability, bikeability, access to transit, creating the density that supports our businesses with people who live here, and making sure that we have a really livable community. I think it's a sign of maturity that we're thinking about transitioning a little bit away from automobile traffic and thinking about those other options. I really support the idea of transit being able to step into that process of helping people who do have those long commutes, folks who need to leave Hillcrest ought to have transit options to be able to do that. And so I'm glad that you guys are thinking about that. I really support walkability, bikeability, transit, trees. I think there was a suggestion in the chat about trees. I think that those can't be an afterthought. I like the idea of the parking hub, and I would encourage you to make it 100% EV charging ready when and if we build something like that. I think the cars that we are going to see are going to be electric cars. I think electric bikes are going to be a solution for people, and so I think we need to plan for those. I think that's it. I just wanted to say that for many of us who are bike riders, the crossing 163 is still a barrier for us. And I know you guys are really excited about Robinson, it seems like. I'm worried about that bottleneck and creating safety for us to get across 163 somehow. So I hope you'll take that into consideration. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you so much.
All right, before I call on the next person, I just want to say I think it'll go Chris and then Nevo. I see Bill Kelly raising your hand. So, and then I also had a request from Sharon Gell to speak, and I see Carol raising her hand. But I think Chris had his proverbial hand up first with the blue hand. So Chris, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, from a very parochial, self-centered point of view, I've been in lots of cities around the world, and I just loved being able just to walk, go out of where I was staying and walk, and there are trees, and I really like that environment. The reality for me, and at my age, maybe I don't care particularly what happens in, let's say, 10 years. But the reality for me is I patronize Hillcrest a lot. And if I can't drive, I probably would look somewhere else, which is fine. If Hillcrest turns into a strictly living and walking and biking area, I think that's beautiful. But there are a lot of people like myself that probably, as far as business is concerned, will have to go somewhere else. And my wife disagrees.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Nevo, and then Sharon, and then Bill.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I'll be pretty quick. I just want to express my appreciation for the transit, bike, and pedestrian exclusive sort of vision for University Avenue. When I moved to Hillcrest a year and a half ago, I was moving because I started grad school at UCSD, and I wanted to live in a neighborhood that I'd be able to walk to the grocery store or bike to the farmer's market, because on a graduate student stipend, I can't afford a car. And Hillcrest was that neighborhood for me because of access to the shuttle. And it's been relatively good compared to some of the other neighborhoods, but it really can be better. And I really strongly support that vision. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sharon, and then Bill, and then Carol.
Hello. I know we've talked about public transit and unique customers for public transit. That means people living close by. We've talked about problems with people having to drive in from other areas because we don't have enough housing here. We've talked about developers. Developers will not build anything unless there's demand. If they want to build something in Hillcrest, it's because there's a demand for housing in Hillcrest. It's all supply and demand. Public transit is supply and demand. You need customers for that public transit. And I know there are people who are afraid of densities, but I'd like to remind you that the greenest city in the US is Manhattan, New York, and they have public transit. And that's why. The density is the reason why. They can use public transit. They don't have to rely on cars. So don't be afraid of density. Don't be afraid of having new neighbors in the neighborhood. It makes the neighborhood more lively. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Bill?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how much are you involved with this planning in terms of by the way, thank you all for your effort. How much involved are you with the age-friendly movement that's been going on in the city and in the county for probably 3 or 4 or 5 years now?
So I'll go ahead and answer that one. We're not directly involved in sort of the age-friendly work in the planning department, but we have other staff in the city of San Diego that is doing sort of direct coordination with the county. And with that said, part of that effort is sort of evaluating policies that for land use and mobility that will further enhance age-friendly communities. So as we start to develop our concepts, we'll continue to work with the staff in the city that is having those direct relations with the county and seeking to achieve and meet the objectives of that, of that effort.
So the point is you're basically are coordinating it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, just like I said, like I am not like the point person on that, but
Right.
we have staff in the city that is, and we've been in communication with them and let them know where we're at in our process, and they've sort of given us their information on that as well.
One more question. Are any of them sitting in on any of these meetings?
The person that I coordinated with, I don't believe is here tonight, but like I said, these meetings are recorded and
Okay.
to follow up with them.
Okay, I appreciate your replies. Thank you.
No, thank you for attending. Carol, you had your hand up. You're still on mute, Carol.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for all you do. Your atlas with all the maps are very helpful. I thought some of Sanjay's comments about the west end of University were very important, and also the west end of Robinson. All of your maps kind of stop right there because the boundary of your particular plan stops right there. So does it just drop off the side of the canyon or what? Anyway, and I'm glad to hear that people like Nevo, who are graduate students, can live here. That is very exciting, good news, and we need to keep rentals and homes affordable in this area. But I also appreciated Ms. Chen and the comments she made about working with the people who currently live here. I think that is really important. Let's see here. I also wanted to mention that we need lighting, even with biking and especially with walking. There are streets with no street lights and it gets very dark and it makes it very difficult. Also, have you looked at the crime maps? There's a lot of crime along University, along Washington, 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and close to the hospital and along Arbor. So neighbors can get together and try to work on these crime issues. We have people falling down in the street. I won't go into all of that right now, but I don't see any of that being addressed with this presentation. And I know it's about mobility, but I think everything needs to be brought into the whole concept of what you're doing. Also, I wanted to mention, you've talked about the pedestrian scramble, which is a great idea. And it was developed, I wanted to give you a little history, in the 1950s by General Electric. And I can tell you more about that if you'd like. My dad was involved with the pedestrian scramble. It was called the Barnes Walk at the time, but it's been around for 70 years and it's a wonderful thing for pedestrians in walkable neighborhoods. So I hope you incorporate more of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any additional hands raised and I haven't seen any messages in the chat. Oh, Carol?
Yeah, trees. I wanted to say thank you for bringing up the tree issue. And yes, trees, trees, trees.
All right, well, thanks for all the comments from the general public. Now I want to go to the subcommittee members that hopefully have been listening to all this and absorbing it all and now can provide some discussion points. So who would like to be recognized first? Matt?
Thanks. I appreciate the presentation, always very thoughtful and a lot of work put into that, and a lot of insightful comments given today. I'll echo a few of the points, but just kind of take that step back. I've heard a lot of comments about how this gets implemented. This is a Hillcrest plan. Ultimately, what we're striving to for 30 years down the road. What are we moving toward for the future? And if we're thinking about the future of Hillcrest, we say, well, what's the population going to be over that time? When we look at, the millennials and the Generation Z and those that are coming up right now, what are the things that those folks have in common? They don't really want to drive much. They want to work from home more and more, and they want to use public transit. That is the future of a thriving community as far as, where, the populace of the US is heading. So from that standpoint, what we're discussing today is perfect for moving in that direction. We talk about what's going to come first. Well, if more people are working from home, we need to offer them homes. If they don't want to drive, we need to offer thriving businesses for them to go to and public spaces for them to utilize. So, having all of that structured into this mix works great. I agree, it's something that has to be really well planned out for how do we transition to this over time. But it's not something that you snap your fingers and this exists in one day. It's a horse and cart scenario here. We need to bring in people to support the businesses. Then we can we can expand beyond that. I do like the idea and have for a while of a parking hub. I do think that does make sense, at least for those who have to come in, because we're not going to have that, that transit across all of San Diego County. We're going to have some ability to bring some people in, even though I'm not a huge fan of trying to add more cars onto the roads. I do like the idea of having university as a full, non-vehicular, public pathway. I think that in itself will drive more and more usage. In other communities, it does create a very thriving business atmosphere and gives you the space to bring in and promote more public events in those areas. So the other two issues I would point out, the tree canopy as well. If we have that open public space, it's going to provide more potential for trees. We will want to have more access to shade in those areas to keep the public there, especially through the summers, and make those areas usable. I forget who brought up the question of crime. I will say that for crime, it's also been proven revitalized spaces and spaces that are used by the public on a regular basis have a reduction in crime. If people are there and people are present, then we're going to see reduced crime statistics. So all of this said, I love where this is going, and those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks. Who's next? Mike?
I'll go, Roy.
So one of the things that I think would be helpful for us as we sort of, evaluate this is like, in response to some of the concepts for University Avenue and what were presented tonight is this, what is your comment and input as it relates to sort of the repurposing of the right of way for those particular facilities, and how could that potentially be guide us for, one, the specific evaluation of university, and two, how we look at further conceptual development for Washington and 4th and 5th and some of the other facilities as well. So I just wanted to sort of at least bring that out there as kind of a prompting question for the discussion on the board, and then if we have time and further discussion amongst the public, if that prompts further input as well.
Thanks, Michael. I think that'll actually help me refocus what I was going to say back to just the questions at hand in regards to the transportation issue. So obviously, some of you know, I mean, this is what I do on a day in and day out basis. And so I feel very passionate about a lot of the issues that you guys have brought up. I think in general, I would agree with a lot of the comments that have been said here in regards to pedestrian and bicycle safety in terms of, making the environment better for pedestrians and bicyclists, whether that be through wider sidewalks, slower vehicle speeds, better places for those two modes to operate safely. And if it happens to come at the expense of vehicles, then so be it. A couple of very specific comments on a couple of things. There's been a little bit of discussion about the overpasses with 163. I'm less concerned about the overpasses with 163 and more concerned about the connections to the 163. The Washington Street interchange is terribly dangerous for bicyclists, and it's completely inaccessible for pedestrians. And as you're coming down from either direction, really on your bike on Washington Street, it is a death-defying experience to survive that place. The other place along Washington, and it was marked on there, is as a high collision incident rate, which could also use some really re-examining, is that weird interchange on Washington where Fifth Avenue ends and quickly makes that right turn up to the hospitals at Scripps. On your bike, again, that's also a very dangerous place. So anything that can be done to make those slip ramps safer, those were the #1 priorities that Uptown Planners identified in our capital improvement recommendations to the city last year, was making that stretch of Washington Street safer. And I think moving towards something other than slip ramps into an urbanized neighborhood would go a long ways. I think the last thing I'd want to say, and I know that we're not talking about land use here, and this is about transportation, but in order for us to build a neighborhood that has less cars in it, we need more people in the neighborhood, so that, as some folks have alluded to, we need more people who can live, work, and enjoy the community within the community to support the businesses that are here. And so land use has to be a definite part of that. And I'll probably get a lot of egg thrown at me for saying this, but Hillcrest is ripe for a lot of improvements. Pericanos is not exactly the best place in San Diego. The Rite Aid parking lot on Washington, or on between 5th and 6th, a great opportunity for some new things. The stretch of land between 5th and 6th on University, also ripe for some energized life. So, this notion that how are we going to pay for these things? We pay for these things through development impact fees, is how we largely pay for them. And we'll get some state money maybe, or some federal money maybe. But this is going to be funded through development impact fees. In order to build new things in a public space, you need developers to build things, and we need the people living in those buildings to frequent our businesses. And so in order for us to get to where we want to go, land use has to be a key part of that. And there is plenty of room in this community. There's plenty of room in Mission Hills. I live in Mission Hills. There's plenty of room in Mission Hills for new neighbors, new buildings, new apartments, new condominiums, new houses. And so it has to go hand in hand. We can't have one without the other.
Thanks, Clint. Who else from the committee would like to speak? Gail, you ready?
Yeah, I don't really have comments before me exactly what I would have said from Clint and Matt. And I just the word, when people throw around the density, for me, that's not a bad word. And I think, I'm a nurse and I don't work at UCSD, but if I could walk, if I did, I'd love the fact that where I live in Hillcrest, I could walk to work. And so that's a huge employer, the medical centers. And if we need those people in a neighborhood. So how can we provide for them? So I guess I'm going to echo that. And again, about the trees, I just think that's really important too. And that's part of what I'm a part of on the beautification committee for the Hillcrest, the HBA, and we are addressing that through there. So we're getting more trees, which is good.
Thank you. Was there anybody else? I guess it's my turn to speak a little bit. So on the one-way street proposal, that's the first time I seen it where it would go all the way through to Park. And that sort of made me scratch my head, because I've always felt that in order to handle larger volumes, but we're not talking about handling cars, we're getting rid of cars. But if you do want to handle cars, the one-way street does give you a more efficient way of moving more cars with less resources. But I always thought it would only be between 1st and 6th. So the concept that it would go all the way down to Park is a new concept, which I have a hard time getting my head around. Because once you get past 6th, it becomes very different. Maybe you could get down to, well, it becomes much more residential a couple blocks past 6th. So it's a strange concept to move all that volume, which under Robinson in that later part. So I would have thought that you'd want to cut over earlier. So if you are seriously studying the one-way option, I would seriously consider partial one-way just in the core. So that was one comment. We did study a lesser use of University Avenue back when we had the original plans for the bicycle, where we thought we could lose a lane on University Avenue in each direction. And at the time it was rejected because the study that was done considered doing it all the way down the full length of University and not just the several blocks between 10th and Robinson, where it would have been feasible. So there might be some possibilities for reduced flow of traffic on University, but zero flow, that's 30 years out, but I guess we're doing a 30-year plan. So 30 years from now, I could see that would be a very interesting plan if I didn't need to drive anywhere. But I am concerned about the businesses on University. The reason I live here and the reason I paid so much for my property moving here was so that I could walk to restaurants and supermarkets and all those things on University. And while I can walk to a lot of them, most of the other people can't. They have to drive, and without those other people driving in, I am concerned about their existence. I hear that if you have enough density, you might support them without those other people coming in, but that would be a very different neighborhood than we have now, where a lot of what we have are people coming from the gay community comes in for the bars and the nightlife. We're not the typical section of University that a lot of University is. And I also know that the rest of University has a lot of other challenges. We sort of have a special, if you go back before, you go back why the gay community was able to take over this area was because it was run down like the rest of University tends to be. Because it's not easily accessible and because it was sort of left for dead. That's how it became, like many other areas around the country that are where the gay neighborhoods moved in. It was because that was the only place that would let them in. The places that were run down and were problematic. And so this is a real change to the way this neighborhood would look. And I'm trying to get my head around it, but it's going to take a while. So that's my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, everyone. Tanner, Monique, Claudia, do any of you have any sort of closing comments or
Hey, Michael, I think Breer was raised his hand and still need to provide comment.
Yeah, of course, Breer, my apologies.
No problem. Hey, thanks a lot. These are really great options. I mean, there's some really forward-thinking stuff going on here. And when I first looked at the presentation, I was really excited about the possibilities of some of these different configurations. I've said before that I think that, the only way to change the character of the neighborhood for the better is to change the way, that space in the right of way is distributed. And I'll just repeat that I think the designs we've been left with from the old way of thinking about the neighborhood, which is bringing a ton of cars in on the freeway to go to the Sears and to come in and go to restaurants and move people around and give them all tons of parking. I think those are the source of a lot of our problems. The blight, the storefronts that are boarded up, the homeless problems. A lot of these things are because, it's not comfortable walking around in many parts of the neighborhood. And I think that when we start to shift these things, we'll be inspiring change, and we'll be inspiring other people to come through and come here and use their bike or use transit. And as we provide opportunities for these other modes, parking will be less important. And also, ideally, the density will grow up with it, right? It's not going to happen 100% one thing, then 100% the other. It's all going to grow together. And that's what I love about looking at these plans, is I can see in the different road configurations, stages that we can mature through. There were a lot of things said that I would like to just support that Clint had said and that Roy had said, and they're all right. And so I won't go on about it, but really I feel like my guiding ideal for what I'm looking at is that I think that, everyone should have the right to live in a place that is healthy and socially just and aesthetically pleasing and rewarding to live in. And I think that we have to really take a bold step with our traffic design in order to achieve some of those things. When I see, like in this image, that there's 2 lanes going in either direction for cars, and I think at all of the options except for the sort of utopian ideal of only having transit, there's 2 lanes going in each direction. And I think that there's some better, or at least in my opinion, or perhaps other interesting options that could be realized by reducing that to 1 lane for cars in either direction. Now, I know that people start thinking that being afraid of traffic or people not being able to get in and move through, but like I said, it's as a way to sort of evolve the neighborhood. I think it's really worth considering, how these other modes of transportation will reduce the need for cars. We live in California. We're still thinking that, everyone's always going to want to drive their car everywhere. But I just want to remind you, as my last point, that the world has already changed. I work from home now. I sold my car. I drove it 1,200 miles last year. And I think that it's a fair assumption that a lot of people's lives that have changed like mine are going to keep those changes. So thanks a lot for this. And that's all I have to say.
All right, Michael, did you have some closing slides?
I do. Just wanted to see, just from our mobility team, because of all the work, if there were any closing comments.
Yeah, I'll just be quick. Obviously, just want to thank everybody for their comments. There's a ton of good stuff that came verbally here, and like we said, a lot of good high-level points or all-level points in the comment box as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. We'll, kind of put together a lot of those comments and get responses back, and just look forward to, continuing to work with this group and for a good plan.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tanner. I'll skip ahead to the end just to preview the next meeting and sort of looking ahead. So again, want to echo what Tanner said. Thank you all for your time and for your input. Our next meeting is Thursday, February 18th, same time, 6:30 p.m. The topic will be the land use and building design and building form. So we'll be talking about, land use, urban design concepts and getting your feedback on sort of some preliminary options. At the March meeting, we'll revisit our parks and public space concepts and refining the information that we received from the group at the December meeting and presenting some revised concepts. And then we'll come back, I believe it's the April meeting with it'll be April or May for the mobility meeting, but we'll have that schedule presented as part of the next month's meeting as well. So as always, my information's available. Any questions or contacts, you can go to planhillcrest.org. Most of you have my contact information, and we will continue to keep you apprised. If you're not signed up, please sign up for the email blast where you'll receive agendas as well as when we post the presentations. And just want to thank everybody. Have a wonderful night. Stay safe, and we will see you in February. And thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, buddy.